Hello, you're watching news from Kazakhstan. I'm Askar Sherliyev. The leader of Ruhpentil Club and journalist Janbolat Mamay was released. Late on Thursday evening, he left the Aktau pre-trial detention facility. To recap, Mamay was arrested on June 15th on charges of inciting social hatred in Zhanaozen, with stage director Bolat Atabayev, who was released last week. The latest details next.
Yes, indeed, Janbolat Mamay was released. He is currently with his father Mamay Bikudriyev, attorney Abzal Kuspanov and Taligen Jukiyev. They are heading to the airport of Aktau city. As his father said, they are flying to Almaty on Thursday. His release was organized by the National Security Committee in such secrecy that no one knew how he will be released and how it's going to happen. Everyone was wondering, including us. We prepared our questions to Janbolat, but we were unable to ask them. Someone called to Taligen Jukiyev, who was standing right near us, and after that Mamay's father and the lawyer sat inside the car and entered the territory of the pre-trial detention facility. From there, the car, in about 15 or 20 minutes, went straight to the airport without any stops. I was able to call and reach Janbolat's father, and he said that everything is all right and that his son is okay and that they're heading to the airport. This is all we know for now. I assume that Taligen Jukiyev made a great impact in the release of Mamay, even though he refused to make any comments and promised to make them after the release. We will be able to find out all the details of his release if they organize a press conference.
7 people, including 2 children, died as a result of an explosion in the private house in Tausamal village of Almaty region on Thursday night. According to Interfax news agency, machine guns and pistols were found in the house after the fire. According to the source of the agency, the killed were likely preparing a bomb.
The Regional Internal Affairs Department reports that the identification of victims is currently underway. A criminal case was initiated on suspicion of terrorism, with the possibility of transferring it to the National Security Committee. At the moment, the premise is fully cordoned by the police, with all photos and videos made by the fire department banned from distribution.
A gas tank explosion was reported initially, but later news websites said the blast was intentional. Currently, an investigation team is working at the scene, and a forensic examination was scheduled to determine what caused the fire. Neighbors who could have witnessed the emergency are reluctant to talk to the press, saying they didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, or they were not home at the time. Law enforcement officials also declined to comment on the incident.
Nursultan Nazarbayev spoke about the incident on Thursday during the anti-terrorism and anti-extremism meeting in the president's administration. The head of state expressed his dissatisfaction with the work of law enforcement agencies, noting that radical extremists exert full pressure on the state and society in general. We must admit that our state and society in general is under high pressure by radical extremist elements. People are outraged by inability of law enforcement to prevent all these crimes. Lack of professionalism lead to casualties among police officers. Due to poor work, we are unable to timely suppress these crimes. As a president and the guarantor of the Constitution, I am dissatisfied with the work of law enforcement, particularly by the National Security Committee. The efforts that we undertake are not effective enough.
20 inmates of the isolation ward 168/1 in October organized an act of self-mutilation. They damaged their stomachs to protest detention conditions. First, it was assumed that the act was organized by religious convicts accused of extremism. However, later the prosecution office refuted this information. Meanwhile, the relatives of inmates arrived to the prison demanding to let them in after they found out about the incident. More details from October region next.
Reporters learned about the protest action in the Aktauber temporary detention facility from a convict's mother. Later, the incident involving 20 inmates slicing their stomachs open was officially confirmed. Almost at the same time, the videos of convicts hanging bedsheets with the word "help" spread on the internet by the inmates' families, filming the events from the roof of a building next door. My husband was beaten last night. I can't tell what it was, but he is certainly injured. There are 6 more victims, but they are afraid to talk about it. I was told that my younger brother is in a coma with his stomach sliced open. According to his fellow inmates, they stuffed gauze inside the wound and covered it with tape, but I personally haven't seen my brother yet. However, the administration of the temporary detention facility has its own story. On July 11th, the defendants demanded additional visits with their families, freedom of movement and use of mobile phones. According to the deputy chief of Aktauber Regional Correctional System Committee, Mirbalat Kipesov, this is a violation of the penitentiary regime. We have allowed 30 family members inside the prison. The prosecutor's office representatives also talked to them. They have seen inmates as proof that no beatings took place. The military prosecutor's office rushed to refute the information that the prison protests have extremist motives. These rumors were stirred by the controversial video of women in headscarves making comments on the situation in prison. The Wahhabist rumor was also discussed. There were a few women in headscarves who looked like Wahhabi's wives. One of them even went up to the roof with the reporters and families. She shouted, "Allah Akbar, brothers, we support you," and they responded from behind the window grates. Journalist Sergei Dovanov heard quite a bit about tortures and riots in penal institutions. He noted that lately convicts became more organized in their protest actions. Per his forecast, the number of inmates convicted for extremism is increasing, which will cause more incidents to happen. This act of self-mutilation indicates that these people are starting to self-organize. These are no longer individuals who protest on their own, but stable groups that protest passively. They might be organizing riots, prison breaks, and armed protests next. All injured inmates were administered medical aid. 5 ambulances were reported at the scene. Representatives of the Correctional System Committee stated they are now holding various preventive activities with the troublemakers. In the meantime, human rights activists note that mass mutilation, hunger strikes, and escapes are very common in Kazakhstan prisons. Facilities in Petropavlovsk, Dalinka, Balkhash, Taraz, Aktau, and Aktobe are notorious for similar incidents. Despite the fact that protests had long been taking place within the penitentiary system, the issue of torture and inhumane incarceration conditions in Kazakhstan is rarely acknowledged.
Jarken Siksimbayev, former employee of Kazakh Ministry of Communication and Information, organized a hunger strike in prison. This way he intends to fight the justice.
In 2009, Jarken Siksimbayev worked as the director of the company kplustv. When the enterprise faced problems with land registration, Siksimbayev approached Saulia Kaliyeva for help. It was later revealed that she worked for a non-existent company, Business Consult Europe. Kaliyeva requested $15,000 for her services. A month after the deal, Kaliyeva asked Siksimbayev for a note that said $15,000 were borrowed from her. With the note in hand, she took legal action against the businessman and demanded him to pay back the debt, which reached $30,000 with interest. The ensuing litigation lasted for 3 years, and in the end, Siksimbayev was charged with fraud. On January 31, 2012, the court released Siksimbayev on his own recognizance pending trial. But for the last 6 months, and for unknown reasons, he was still held in the detention center. Siksimbayev's attorney, Alexander Gulevsky, wrote a complaint letter to the ruling party, Nuratan. We have already sent a written appeal to the city and general prosecutor offices, but despite that, unfortunately, Siksimbayev still remains in the detention center.
On Thursday, Zhanaozen City Court, chaired by the judge Baurjan Yelemesov, continued the hearing of the former mayor of Zhanaozen, Zhalgaz Babakhanov. After lengthy negotiations, the judge allowed the press to enter, as well as an observer from Zhanaozen 2011 committee, Yerlan Kaliyev, to be present in the courtroom, and even provided several minutes for video and audio recordings.
As was previously reported, the criminal case involving Zhalgaz Babakhanov, the predecessor of Mayor Orak Sarbapeyev, is reviewed by Zhanaozen City Court, although similar trial with almost identical charges against Sarbapeyev was held in Aktau in the presence of jury. The process over the ex-city administrator, who was in charge of Zhanaozen for 14 years, is ongoing for several days now. The court questioned witnesses, mostly former and currently working officials, who interacted work with the ex-mayor. These are the same people who were part of the Zhanashur Fund Board of Trustees, and whose money, according to the investigators, the mayor spent at his discretion. Allegedly, he bought real estate, cars, and reimbursed the expenses of officials who were frequently involved in business activities. All the while, the funds of the oil company were intended for socially vulnerable residents of the city. Witnesses Khairov and Abu Bakirov did not dispute an appropriate allocation of funds, but also said the decision was made jointly by the trustees. The trial will continue on July 13th. Currently, only ex-officials and present staff of the mayor's office are involved in the process, with prospecting and development company Kazmonagaz acting as the sole victim in the case. On Thursday, the representative of the company failed to voice the amount of estimated damage, citing high workload. All these criminal cases initiated against both Sarbapeyev and Babakhanov are directly and indirectly linked to tragic events in Zhanaozen. Despite my affiliation to court trials of Zhanaozen oil workers, I can tell that those hearings were far more open. I don't understand why they're creating so many hurdles for Sarbapeyev's trial, although it was announced that these processes will be open. As you can see, I traveled here to specifically examine this issue. I talked with the court officer, and based on their reaction, I can say that there are many questions for which I can't find any answers.
The appellate court in Aktau left unchanged the verdict to the former head of Zhanaozen temporary detention facility, Zhenizbek Timirov, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
Timirov was found guilty of abuse of office. The former head of the detention center was charged with illegally detaining Bazarbai Kenjibayev during the unrest in Zhanaozen on December 16, 2011. According to the investigation, Timirov failed to provide timely medical care for Kenjibayev, who later died from injuries received in the detention center. On May 17th, the court found him guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison with confiscation of property and a ban to hold positions in law enforcement agencies for 5 years. Timirov's lawyers lodged an appeal looking for full acquittal, whereas his father, serving as public defender, asked the court to change the charges and pardon Timirov. In the end, the court kept its original ruling unchanged. The lawyer and public defender have different stands on this case. His father is requesting to change the penalty by switching to less severe charges, which would qualify him for the president's pardon. The defendant himself asked for full acquittal. Everyone understood what each party wanted, but the court kept its decision without considering the requests. I am the daughter of the late Bazarbai Kenjibayev, and I officially state that no one helped us and apologized to us. Timirov said that if he knew about Kenjibayev's internal injuries, he would take him to the hospital, but the court would not accuse him if he was innocent. I think the court made a right ruling, and I stand behind it.
The expectation of Prime Minister Karim Masimov's visit to Zhanaozen brought no results to several women whose husbands are imprisoned for long prison terms for the participation and organization of mass riots. Since early morning, the wives and mothers of oil workers were waiting for the Prime Minister near the newly constructed production branch building of Kazmunaygas and later moved to the city administration building.
The tedious wait under the scorching Aktau sun with air temperatures reaching 40 degrees and high humidity was in vain. The day was especially tough for the 70-year-old mother of Narinjarul Gasinov, Sandor Aktayeva, who suffered from rising blood pressure. Administration members did not explain to local residents that the date of Prime Minister's visit is still unknown. At noon, the head of Zhanaozen DIA, Amangildi Dosakhanov, approached the women and attempted to convince them to leave the premise, although retreating immediately after spotting reporters in the crowd. Wives and mothers of oil workers did leave eventually, but planned to come back the next day. According to unofficial sources, Prime Minister Karim Masimov will be in Zhanaozen for a very short time. Town residents say he will visit the opening ceremony of Kazmunaygas building, renovated after the fire, and open 2 apartment blocks built for state employees.
UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Navanathan Pillai demanded from Kazakh authorities to change several national laws, particularly on religion, mass media, freedom of assembly, and bring them to the standards of international law. However, most of the press conference, Pillai talked about the riots in Zhanaozen. She noted the excessive use of force during the suppression of the riots, inadequate investigation of the case, and the trial, which according to her was not entirely fair. More details in the next report.
The official Astana was clearly startled by the visit of the main United Nations human rights official. Within less than a day, Navanathan Pillai managed to meet with the heads of almost all departments involved in protection of human rights, although mostly behind closed doors. The meetings where the press was allowed were limited to protocol parts. These seldom meetings with the presence of the press, Navanathan Pillai opened with harsh statements. For instance, she has expressed her discontent to the ombudsman for not considering complaints about the president of the country. At the meeting with Igor Rogov, the head of the Constitutional Council, Pillai noted that the agency cannot revise presidential decrees. Also, it was the first time the UN representative talked about violations concerning the riots in Zhanaozen.
I'm concerned that proper investigation of numerous allegations of ill treatment was not included in accordance with the country's obligations under the Convention Against Torture.
At the summary press conference, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights paid special attention to the tragic events in Zhanaozen. In her report, she clearly indicated all the violations that led to riots, which the authorities could not curb after shooting the demonstrators. Who gave the order to open fire at unarmed citizens? Neither the Attorney General nor the Interior Minister could answer her question. According to the human rights activists, the trial did not cast light upon the excessive use of force and improper investigation of criminal cases. Thus, the verdict is a result of misunderstanding.
I
think it is really detrimental to the image of Kazakhstan, while such a serious matter that caused so many deaths still hangs in uncertainty. Therefore, I strongly recommend to the government to allow an independent international investigation, as it is the only way to shed light upon these tragic events. Answering reporters' questions, the High Commissioner said she would be closely monitoring the investigation of cases against opposition members accused of inciting social hatred. In her report, Pillai emphasized the unequal distribution of oil revenues and disadvantages of labor law and the law on freedom of assembly. The human rights activist demanded that the government amend some of the legislation, in particular about religion. In Pillai's opinion, it causes fear among citizens. Another concern is the law on the media, the repressive norms of which prevent some journalists from covering riots like those in Zhanaozen. Local experts support and complement the High Commissioner's demands. Western countries have to decide whether they want a member country that does not meet the standards of the OSCE and other international organizations. Thus, political pressure is the only solution. In her report, Pillai emphasized that within 48 hours of her visit to Kazakhstan, she has made her vision of the human rights situation in the country. Even this amount of time was enough for the High Commissioner to make comparisons with the rebellious Tunisia, where the financial prosperity of the country was gained at the expense of civil, political, and social rights of the country's citizens. This note of warning needs no comment.
Rahim Utenov, resident of Shymkent, is planning to appeal to the UN International Committee on Human Rights. A year ago, during a car accident in Zhambul region, his son died and he became disabled. The driver of the passenger bus who caused the crash was pardoned by Zhambul court. The relatives of the late claimed that the trial was held with violations and demand a compensation for moral and material damage in Shymkent court.
When I first saw him, he said that his wife's brother works as a driver for Karat Mami, the Senate chair. Second time I saw him, he said that I would fail anyway, even if I tried. The law enforcement office of Mirkin region asked me to pay $3,000 to deal with this. I wrote to the president's administration regarding the bribe. Things haven't changed a bit, and it's been 10 months already. That is why we passed the case to the court. The tragedy occurred on June 21st last year when a passenger bus crossed onto the oncoming lane of the Merkyashu highway and collided with a car, killing its driver on the spot. His father, Rahim Utenov, was left handicapped. According to expert review, the bus was in poor technical condition. The trial did not start until after numerous appeals to the General Prosecutor's Office and the President's administration. The court's verdict outraged the accident victims, and now they are planning to appeal to international human rights advocates about the matter.
Здесь вот удивляет другое. Почему одновременно с постановлением...
When the court suspended the criminal case due to pardon, it was supposed to transfer it to the inter-district court for the consideration of traffic rules violations and decide whether the driver should be deprived of his license. The court failed to do that.
Административный суд материалы по факту нарушения.
Members of the Democratic Society delegation informed Italian senators in Rome about Kazakhstan's human rights situation. Journalists and activists brought to the attention of European officials what took place in Zhanaozen. They spoke about the strike that ended with the shooting of citizens, trials over oil workers, and later arrests of activists, reporters, and intellectuals. According to activists, Kazakhstan and Italy successfully cooperate in trade and economic relations, and therefore Rome should not be indifferent to the state of affairs in the country. Senators pledged to address officials in Accorda as well as diplomatic missions, saying they will continue to insist on participation as independent observers at trials in Aktau. To recap, lawyers filed an appeal against the sentence on the case of 37 oil workers.
It is likely that independent mass media in Kazakhstan will be persecuted after Kozlov's trial is over. I'm talking about newspapers Respublika and Vzгляд, TV channel K+, as well as other opposition media, of which there are not many in Kazakhstan. Italian senators believe that it is necessary to communicate with democratic opposition now in order to prevent the repeat of Syria and Libya. I believe this is a very positive development.
On Thursday, the UN High Commissioner announced that Kazakhstan needs a new law on mass media which excludes libel from criminal acts. The existing law was labeled draconian by Navanathan Pillai. The media community once again demanded the decriminalization of a series of articles in the penal code, including libel and defamation.
Members of the media have a very sore issue on the agenda. They are discussing unfairness of criminal prosecution of journalists for libel and defamation. More precisely, the fact that if someone mentioned in a publication perceives it as an insult, it is already subjective in itself. Most of the speakers are for the decriminalization of libel, in other words, making it an administrative violation. The president's advisor attending the roundtable adds to the intrigue. He hints that pushing the project will lead to some problems. In the last 5 years, I had a chance to see that decriminalization of defamation has a lot of opponents, including among top officials, who absolutely do not want to move this issue forward. The administration envoy immediately appealed to the MPs, saying that since the parliament works on laws, they should discuss the draft in September. Nurlan Abdirov and Viktor Rogalyov looked puzzled. It seems they don't want to take up such obligations. I cannot talk for others, but for example, Viktor Rogalyov has already spoken here today. As you understand, everything depends on the MPs. Yertizbayev has put all the burden of responsibility exclusively on the parliament, to be more specific on Rogalyov and myself. The head of the Foundation for Protection of Freedom of Speech, Tamara Kaleyeva, believes the draft is not reconsidered on purpose, because this is a way to intimidate reporters into submission and prevent them from digging into private lives of senior officials, lest something embarrassing is disclosed. I have an impression this is a personal fear for their privacy. All authors of these proposals, all opponents of decriminalization, are simply afraid and want to protect themselves. By chance, this very issue was addressed yesterday by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Navanathan Pillai called prosecution of media and sentencing of journalists for libel a draconian measure. She also pointed out that the field for public criticism in Kazakhstan is narrowing, and in general the country needs an updated law on media, where libel is excluded from the criminal code.
Head of the Journalists' Union, Kazim Ataev, expressed the opinion on Thursday, saying that journalistic code of ethics must be initiated by the press and not by the state. Earlier, Nursultan Nazarbayev ordered the Information Ministry to draft a special code for mass media.
In any case, this code must first be discussed by the journalistic community. It is very important because it directly concerns us. Besides, it should not be introduced in legislation because due to the large number of lawsuits related to journalists, the authorities are just going to rub this in our faces, saying that since we've adopted this code of ethics, we must comply with it. So this simply will give them one more leverage against us. The media expert also believes that the main punishment under the future code should be denunciation within the professional community, not criminal prosecution or fines. Mataev is also not sure whether the idea will be supported by all the outlets in the country. Obviously, the state-owned publication will have to sign the document. It's a presidential decree after all. The head of state explained that this way the media will follow not only general unpublicized rules of behavior, but also distinct rules of law, which will protect consumers from distorted and inaccurate information. Attempts to introduce the code of ethics were made for the past 10 years. The reaction from within the journalistic community has been mixed as well. For instance, the well-known journalist from Uralsk, Lukman Akhmedyarov, believes the suggestion of Nazarbayev is nothing but empty rhetoric. This code was drawn up on paper by the President's administration office in no time. Is anything going to change within our media market? I don't think so. Khabar TV and Kazakhstan 1, with all the rubbish on the air, will remain the same. The nonsense of Kazakhstan Pravda is not going anywhere either.
A single regional air defense system will unite Kazakhstan and Russia. The treaty is scheduled to be signed in 2013, but experts already debate the pros and cons of the agreement.
Currently, CIS member states are linked through a combined air defense system that allows informational exchange. The question remains open as to why the additional unified air defense system is needed. Experts say that the consequences will not be known until the conditions of the agreement are voiced. While the documents are being arranged, it is necessary to identify the location of the command center that will send orders regarding mid-air target elimination. Who will make the final call in case of Kazakhstan's airspace breach, Astana or Moscow? Which one will press the button and destroy the target? If the decision is taken by Moscow, it will be a violation of Kazakhstan's sovereignty.
Collections of humanitarian aid for the Kuban flood victims began in Almaty, organized by Share the Light social movement. Activist Irina Weissman was glad many have responded. Earlier, employees of one of the largest personal hygiene companies called the movement's office, offering to provide 20,000 packages of their products.
The movement activist Irina Weissman is glad that many people responded to the appeal. Recently, the community office received a call from a personal care company willing to donate 20,000 packages of their product. Irina hopes that the aid provided by the neighboring country will contribute to overcoming the dreadful tragedy. People willing to assist flood victims may submit warm clothes, personal hygiene products, kitchenware, and washing agents. The items can be delivered to the following address: Bogenbai Batyr Street 86, Office 503, Almaty. The cargo will be sent to Krymsk on July 18th. The flood in Krasnodar damaged over 5,000 private homes and killed 170 people. They lack workforce, volunteers, and people providing physiological aid. We know this, and our movement is ready to send human resources there. The only problem is that we can't afford to cover transportation costs. If we find a sponsor willing to cover the expenses, we would gladly go there and do what we can.
This is all we have time for now. Thank you for watching us. Stay tuned.